right, thank you. Let's see, where's screen? One second, why am I? I am not getting, oh boy.
Are you trying to share your screen?
Yeah, with my PowerPoint.
There it is.
Here we go.
It's coming.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Jed. And here. All right, here we go. I think we're all set. And so does human rights fit into an evolution, naturalistic theory of evolution? So we want to look at this from a number of different perspectives, and I wanted to start off a little bit, I think, in an interesting way. And that's, so here's the search is a moral imperative to help those who are unable to help themselves, so the less fortunate. Is there a way in which our worldview can accommodate the call to help those who are in need as a moral imperative? So that would be the highest kind of obligation. And so I wanted to start off by saying there are several kinds of beauty. I think beauty is a fascinating topic for us to look at, and there are many kinds of beauty. But there's one, I'm going to break it down into three categories. The first one is majestic beauty. And that's majestic beauty is a sense of awe. So something that draws you in because it's, there's a beauty to it, draws you in, but at the same time, it terrifies you. This may be sort of the majestic beauty of God. That's the kind of revering God, you know, where you sense the love of God, and yet at the same time, there's a fear of God kind of mixed in. So majestic beauty, and you see that in Niagara Falls. If you ever went to Niagara Falls and you look, there's that sense of beauty that draws you in, and yet the sense of terror. When I went to Europe a couple of times, and maybe you have as well, and you've seen the churches, when you walk into a church in Europe, there's a sense of awe because of the huge expanse that's inside the churches. And I'm told that the churches were built that way so that when you walk in, your imagination is prepared to meet God, because God is this humongous, this that fills the expanse. But someone had written that if you go to churches, modern churches in America, it's built out like a mall, you know, like a shopping mall. It's an interesting contrast. And then let's see, the eye of a hurricane, that's the magnitude of it, and yet at the same time, there is a beauty. There's a second type, and this is what I call mathematical beauty, but it's the sense of beauty that's proportion, symmetry, order, and clarity of color. So this is the most beautiful ceilings in the world. You can see the deep symmetry and color there. This is another example of one of the most beautiful ceilings in the world as well. And then a third one, but these are symmetry, proportion, mathematical properties of beauty. That's at Chicago, the Buckingham Palace, symmetry and proportion. These are the stained glasses. I think Saint-Chapelle is right next to Notre Dame in Paris, but beautiful, especially when the light comes in. And then you have the garden and the flowers. There's symmetry, there's beauty, there's color as well. And then the galaxies, the pictures that we get from outer space. But there's a third kind of beauty, and the third kind of beauty was explored mainly by Martin Luther. Luther's theology of beauty, and I'll call it gracious beauty, but it's a beauty that's, if you look at the bottom, love to the loveless, shown that they might lovely be. I just love the way that it's phrased. And Luther looked at Jesus, for love to the loveless, shown that they may lovely be, as the most beautiful of all beautiful things in the world because it offered gracious beauty, that there's something about the beauty that Jesus offers that's, that attracts you, that inspires you. I remember, I don't know if you guys watched the Les Mis. I always kind of tear up a little bit when Jean Valjean goes into the Catholic Church, right? And they take him in, and then in the middle of the night, I think he steals candlesticks or something, and then he runs away and he's caught by the police, and they come back and the priest says, oh, you took the candlesticks, you left behind these plates or these other precious things, and he gives it to him. And what an act of grace. That's gracious beauty, and that kind of beauty moves us, it attracts us, it makes us want to replicate it. I think I said earlier, when you encounter beauty, you want to reproduce it, like beautiful art or beautiful music or melody. And so Luther says that there's a gracious form of beauty, and that's in Christ, that with the outward, the eyes of unbelief, he does not look beautiful. And so it cites Isaiah 53. But if you have eyes of faith, what happens is you see his inner beauty, because Jesus is the one who loves the loveless so that they may be loved or known that they are loved. And so with this, Luther goes out and provides two illustrations from the New Testament. So that's the father and the prodigal son. The prodigal son who says, Father, my life would be better if you were dead. And he takes his portion of inheritance and he goes away. And then he comes back and he is received. That's gracious love, the loveless receiving love that they may be loved. And then the second one is the adulterous woman that's caught. I think in the middle of the act, and the Pharisees religiously bring her out and bring her to Jesus. And Jesus gets down and begins to write, and then they all disappear. He who is without sin cast the first stone. And Luther says that there's a sense of beauty in this event, and that this woman who is loveless has been shown love. That there's the beauty of the Christian faith, if I were to use Luther's language, is that those who are the loveless ones of God have been extended this love through the cross, through the death of Jesus Christ. Now, I use this because the Genesis of Liberation, I think one of our guest speakers talked about this a couple of weeks ago. And the thesis of this book is, how in the world did slaves adopt the religion of their masters when the masters used that religion as a way of subjugating them? And the response is, well, these slaves found something beautiful within that religion, and they adopted it as their own. So this is from the first and second pages. Afro-Americans' respect for the authority of the Christian scriptures is a miracle in itself. The religion they were offered did not emphasize the love of Christ in response to their choice of will, but the subjugation of their wills as a divine duty to other humans who laid claim to theirs. The masters who used text, slaves be obedient to your masters even when they're not looking. They also found Jesus, a suffering Savior whose life and struggles paralleled their own struggles. That they found this connection as slaves with the main hero of the Christian story, and how the Christian story made those who are loveless, that love was poured out upon them. This book was shared, this book was reviewed in Christianity Today, why the enslaved adopted the religion of their masters and transformed it. And in this review, so the reviewer writes, why did enslaved Africans embrace the religion of their captors who used the Bible to justify the brutal transatlantic slave trade? Well, Pyrie and Sandor's simple answer is that they fell in love with the God of Scripture. In Christ, they found salvation from their sins and reconciliation. They conclude that though this was certainly enough, there was more to the answer. They write, in these texts, they found not just an otherworldly God offering spiritual blessings, but a here and now God who cared principally for the oppressed, acting historically and eschatologically to deliver the downtrodden from their abusers. They also found Jesus a suffering Savior whose life and struggles paralleled their own. In other words, these slaves found something beautiful in this Christian religion, the beauty of which I think Luther was talking about, and they embraced it as their own, transforming it to certain degrees. And so there's a beauty within the Christian faith. The question is, can naturalistic evolution explain this beauty? Is it the beauty of stepping out on behalf of the downtrodden? So the way we would word it in our Sunday school, can naturalistic evolution explain human dignity in the UDHR? So just a brief recap. Remember the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? There's like 31 human rights that were stated out. And it came out because after World War II, the world began to see more and more what Nazi Germany had done, genocide of an entire people group. And so the UDHR was written to safeguard the rights of all people. And in it, we talked about how there's an inherent dignity, cannot be removed, equal and inalienable rights that emerge out of that dignity, so that every human being has dignity and worth. And these human rights are grounded in human dignity. So those two parts are found in the UDHR. But what they do not do is answer the question, what makes human beings dignified? Why are they dignified? To answer that question would have caused the 18 committee members to unable to resolve that particular question. There would be too much conflict. And so Maritain is a Catholic philosopher who is part of the main group. He says, look, we agree on these rights, providing we are not asked why. With the why, the dispute begins. So the UDHR never answered the question of why do we have these particular rights? And so the question here is, can evolution be the source of human dignity? And my answer is, it would be extremely difficult in order for evolution to provide the grounds by which you can view human beings as being qualitatively different than animals, whereby they have human rights, not just animal rights. So let me clarify the question. The question on hand is not who is more moral, atheist or theist. That's not what we're arguing here. Question is, which worldview best supports human dignity? Dawkins has this one statement in his book, The God Delusion. It seems to me to require a low self-regard to think that should belief in God suddenly vanish from the world, we should all become callous and selfish hedonists with no kindness or charity or generosity, nothing that would deserve the name of goodness. This is not what we are dealing with, right? If you reject belief in God, will you be less kind? Perhaps, perhaps not. But that's not the issue here. Secondly, atheism versus theism. The question on hand is not, can atheists know what is morally right? Can they know what human rights are and which ones constitute human rights? But the question is, does naturalism see humans as uniquely worthy of respect? That's the question. We do not want to get sidetracked. And this is William Rose says, look, God is not needed for atheists to understand that rape is immoral. We can know it without God, right? Rape violates victims' rights, undermines societal cohesion. See, those are two things that we can know why rape is immoral. Once again, the question is not, can atheists know what is immoral or what violates human rights? The question is the victim's rights. Where's their rights coming from? From human dignity. Why do human beings have that dignity? That's the question that we want to focus upon. All human beings are equal, born free and born free and equal in dignity and rights. Question is, why do we have them? Okay. So we want to clarify the question. So point one, naturalistic evolution has difficulty providing a metaphysical gap between humans and animals. I think you guys are all aware the theory of evolution has a continuity that's built in from non-living entity to the very first living cells, all the way to the most complex being of all human beings here on Earth. And so this is James Rachels. James Rachels is a well-known philosopher, American philosopher, and he is specializes in ethics and animal rights. And he says the idea of human dignity is nothing more than the moral effluvium. So this is like smell that comes from a rotten thing. This is the odor of a discredited metaphysics. The bare fact that one is human entitles one to no special consideration. So in the theory of evolution, it does not afford human dignity. That comes from a religion that has been discarded. He goes on and he says, look, natural selection has consequences that people have barely begun to appreciate. Discrediting human dignity is one of the most important implications of Darwinism. He does not believe the theory of evolution and human dignity can cohere together. Darwin's theory leads inevitably to the abandonment of the idea of human dignity and the substitution of a different sort of ethic, a different sort of ethic that's not built upon the dignity and worth and sacredness of the human being. So what Richards is trying to do is separate evolution from human dignity. He's going to say, look, you got to choose one or the other. If you choose human dignity as part of a religion, that's superstition. It's gone out the door. If you choose evolution, then you have to reject dignity. You have to have one or the other, but you cannot have both. Because in his view, the theory of evolution cannot support human dignity. In fact, he says, look, there are two necessary claims to support human dignity. There are two things. One, there's a sharp distinction between human and non-human animal life. Difference in degree, in kind, not degree. You need that in order to say human rights and animal rights are two qualitatively different kinds of rights. But we don't have that in the theory of evolution. In fact, there's a continuity that's built where human beings are linked to other higher life forms, chimpanzees, and then you have Darwin's famous tree of life, that we're all connected in this continuous stream of living organisms. And then the second thing he says that you need to support human dignity, the grounds to prioritize human rights over animal rights, right? So right now, in the UDHR, human rights are higher than animal rights. In fact, human beings have a right to use animals in ways that humans cannot use other humans for. But for him, human rights are a subset of animal rights because there's no gap between animal and human life. It's a subset. Human rights is nothing more than a part of animal rights. In fact, human rights are animal rights for Rachel's in a theory of evolution. So a moral gap exists in the sense that human rights are higher than animal rights. That's a moral gap that exists in spite of the metaphysical continuity. Without that metaphysical continuity, there should be no moral gap. So the question that's asked, if you look at the bottom left, you have sort of like the primordial soup where life first arose. In that primordial soup, you have single cell living organisms, you got plants, you got amphibians, and then you got higher conscious animal life, and then you have human beings way on top. The question is, how can valueless material and processes lead to an invaluable product? There's no metaphysical gap, and therefore there should be no gap between human rights and animal rights. This is what Rachel is arguing. Let me go back. So point number two, there's no metaphysical gap that distinguishes human beings in kind from animals. Point number two, naturalistic evolution has difficulty making room for radical altruism, for self-sacrificial altruism. There's no room for that in the theory of evolution. So here you have the story of Zal Krasinski. This is an interesting story, actually. He's a multimillionaire real estate agent, and he gave all of his money away, and then he started donating parts of his body to strangers. So he donated his kidney to a woman that he did not know because he believed that all life was equal. His life was no more worthy than anyone else, and he just started giving all away. A very self-sacrificial type of altruism. And then you have Peter Singer. Peter Singer is one of the most, probably the most famous ethicists in America, probably 20, 30 years ago and on, and a prolific writer, and says, I like to see it become unacceptable to be comfortably off and do nothing for the world's poor. We live in a comfortable setting, and it's not right to live that comfortably when the the world has a number of people who are starving and who do not have access to clean water. In fact, he said you shouldn't be buying bottled water, and you shouldn't be buying $5 coffee at Starbucks. You should take all that money and then you should send it over. And so that's a wonderful sentiment, but he's also an atheist. And so the question is, how does he ground such radical altruism? And the third one is Julian Baggini, and is morality always contains the possibility of requiring one to act against one's own interest. If I'm never prepared to sacrifice some self-interest, then I do not think I can be truly moral. Morality requires some type of cost to the self. Question is, where does the value of radical altruism arise from? Arise in a naturalistic theory of evolution? I'm going to argue that it's very difficult. In other words, there's two issues here. There's no metaphysical gap between animals and human beings. And secondly, the call to be altruistic, the call to help those who cannot help themselves, I do not believe there's room for that in the theory of evolution. So look, can altruism as a biological adaptation provide a basis for human rights as a moral obligation, as something that we ought to do to the point of radical self-sacrifice? And I'm going to answer no. So there are two main drives in the theory of evolution. The first one is competition, and you guys know, heard of, right? The survival of the fittest, the competition. So Darwin was working mainly off of Malthus, who was a theorist in economics. And what he argued was that population growth was exponential, but growth in resources was linear. And so what happens is at a certain time, the population will outgrow the availability of resources so that competition will occur for the limited resources. And those who are weaker, less industrious, or not as smart, will die out. And Darwin applied this theory into his theory of evolution, so that you have the first drive, competition. In the struggle for survival, the fittest went out at the expense of their rivals because they succeed in adapting themselves best to their environment. The more you are adapted to the environment, the higher your rate of survival because you produce more progeny, more descendants. This is the nature red in tooth and claw, the survival of the fittest drive. But there's a second drive, and the second drive is altruism. So you see the gorillas picking, I think, fleas and things from the fur of other gorillas, and then bees working together. So that increased fitness for the other at the cost of one's own fitness. And here what you have is a form of altruism where you're helping each other. And this is the second part of the evolutionary drive. So that you have both competition and cooperation. You need both in order for evolution to produce higher organisms. So the question is, which instinct rules? So in terms of altruism, it works best within species. So that if you're a member of the same species, you help each other, you protect each other, you call out when danger appears. But survival of the fittest works between species, competition between the species. So you have this statement by David Wilson, selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary. Those are the two main key points, right? Competition within groups. Selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups. So that increase in altruism, greater the survival, increase in population, you have more limited resources, so that those species that work together can compete better with other species that do not work together. Now, this type of altruism, called kinship altruism, was first formulated by Hamilton. This is Hamilton's rule, so that if you have the donor, the one that's paying the price of fitness, and then you have the recipient, if the recipient is genetically more distant from you, the less you are willing to be altruistic to them. The reason why is the closer the recipient is to you genetically, you are still following the law of evolution. You are passing down your genes to the next generation through your kin. So that when a parent sacrifices their life for the child, you are passing down your genes through the child so that altruism makes sense. The further the recipient is from the donor, the less responsible he or she is towards them. That's kinship altruism. So that if you look here, on the left side, you have cooperation between members of the same species. On the right side, you have cooperation between members of the same species. But between species, you have this competition that occurs. The group which displays more altruistic behavior within their kinship group will generally have greater access to their resources. And this is Hamilton's law. Kinship altruism is a mechanism for evolution that enables it to survive among competing other species. This is the man who proved that altruism itself. This is a very interesting story. This is George Price, and there's a play that's written about him. And George Price came across Hamilton's rule and thought, wait a minute, this is really just selfishness. And then he tried to prove that it wasn't selfishness, couldn't do it, concluded that Hamilton's rule is not really altruism, it's just selfishness. And then, he found God, and then he tried to live his life in an unselfish manner. But I'm using this because he explains Hamilton's rule in 2 paragraphs. Not a man to settle for a whole-home existence. In 67, Price left his 2 daughters and his ex-wife, determined to make his mark in London. It was there he happened upon a paper that was to change his life, work by the eminent evolutionary biologist Hamilton, which sought to explain why organisms demonstrate altruistic behavior. Altruism is nothing to do with the warm glow, explains Professor Gaffin, one of the play's scientific advisors and a biologist at the University of Oxford. The biological meaning of altruism is to do with reducing the number of offspring you have in your lifetime and simultaneously increasing the number of offspring another individual has in their lifetime, meaning you're reducing your fittedness, the number of descendants, to increase someone else's number of descendants. Hamilton concluded that altruism was passed down the generations because the trait benefited the fitness of an organism's relatives. Hamilton is famous for working on the evolution of altruism and explaining altruism in terms of kin selection, as Dr. Gardner, another of the play's scientific advisors and a biologist at the University of St. Andrews. So individuals nepotistically being altruistic towards their relatives because they share genes in common with those individuals. In other words, as Gaffin puts it, Hamilton claimed to have shown that individual natural selection, if it affects social behavior, can cause organisms to behave in a way that looks altruistic, but actually it is genetically selfish. What needs to occur is to take genetic selfishness or kinship altruism and turn it into radical altruism. In other words, standing up for those who are in need. This has to occur in order for human rights to be a viable moral principle in naturalism. So Dawkins tries to do this. Now, I want to show you how Dawkins tries to do this. The question is, well, why, now that most of us live in big cities where we are no longer surrounded by kin, right? A lot of your kin have moved away. And where every day we meet individuals whom we are never going to meet again, strangers, why are we still so good to each other? Even sometimes to others who might be thought to belong to an out-group. So perhaps the Mother Teresa syndrome, where we're good to people we don't share genes with. He goes on, could it be that our Good Samaritan urges are misfirings, analogous to the misfiring of a weed robber's parental instincts when it works itself out to the bone of a young cuckoo? Or even a closer analogy is the human urge to adopt a child. It's a misfiring, carries no suggestion of the pejorative. So if I go and adopt a child, and I'm altruistic to the child, but I share no genes with the child or very little genes with the child, Dawkins says that this is a misfiring. It works contrary to the flow of the mechanics of evolution. And he's saying by misfiring, don't take it pejoratively. It's not a bad thing. It's just contrary to the mechanics of the theory of evolution. So he uses sex as an illustration. But from an evolutionary point of view, sex is really a reward mechanism to encourage us to pass on our genetic material. That's the role that sex plays within the theory of evolution. So Dawkins says, look, when in the theory of evolution, sex, when it's firing properly, is intended to produce children. But in our human societies, we have sexual encounters where having children is not possible. Sort of like when we have intimacy to demonstrate love for each other, but where, let's say, one person is unable to have children, or let's say when a menopause has occurred and children is not possible, and yet we still have sex. Why is that? Or when sexuality is used as an economic means. That's not to produce children, but we still do that. And then pedophile, that's not to produce children. What he says is these are misfirings that operate contrary to the mechanism of the theory of evolution, and that these misfirings, one of those possibilities, is that we can use sexuality for more than just producing children. We have options that are available to us because of these misfirings. What he's going to do is he's going to use the concept of misfiring in order to talk about the altruism, radical altruism. So look, altruism should work. I think that's the Dougal family, what is it, 16, whatever children in their family. So that when you have altruism should work in kinship models with family members, you are altruistic towards them. But a misfiring is when you adopt someone that's outside of your race, or when you're going and helping people from other parts of the world, the homeless, the civil rights. All of these are misfirings. And what he's arguing is that these misfirings provide opportunity for human beings to demonstrate radical altruism. In other words, if there's no misfirings, the only altruism would be kinship altruism and reciprocal altruism. I help you, you help me. But in these misfirings where I help someone where they can't really help me, these types of settings are opportunities for us to embrace as part of our lifestyle. Evolution provides these options because of these misfirings. I put this in because that's an interesting, because what Dawkins does is, Dawkins has been in trouble a little bit in recent years because he defends his mild form of pedophilia. So he was abused in boarding school, and he kind of defends this, it's not rape, but this mild kind of sexual touching and things. And he's done that in a number of interviews. And Dawkins has been defending it. But see, these are misfirings of sexually. And not all misfirings are automatically viable things that human beings ought to do. Instead, we take these misfirings and then we evaluate which ones to adopt and which ones not to. And so in the case of sexuality, pedophile, perhaps prostitution, different forms of revenge sexuality. These are all forms of misfirings that you can reject and then adopt ones like sexuality for demonstrating intimacy between married couples. You would embrace that. So that the misfirings are not automatically embraced. You have to use some type of principle to say, I accept this, but I reject that. What I believe is Dawkins and the naturalists who affirm human rights are stealing the concept of human dignity from Christianity and using that as an implicit assumption to kind of get their theory to work. In fact, if you look here, Darwin's hope was that kinship altruism within a tribe would continue to grow, and then these tribes would enter into reciprocal altruistic relationships so that they would help each other. The problem with this particular hope, so that you would have peace in the long term, the problem is that if one tribe becomes more powerful than another tribe, what that means is reciprocal altruism no longer needs to operate between two different kinship groups, because reciprocal altruism comes into play when both groups can generally benefit from each other. But if one group is so powerful than another group that they don't need to give anything but can simply take, then you have a problem. And this is the obstacle that Darwin is experiencing. And this is Darwin writing in the late 1800s, and this is the prime British Empire. I read somewhere that Britain owned or colonized 25% of the world at one point. And huge, right? But they have the power to take what they want. But the power differential between competing tribes overwhelms all sense of brotherhood, right, that we're all from the same life, and makes reciprocal altruism irrelevant. This is the problem. Power violence versus self-sacrificial love. And so the difficulty of altruism as a basis for human, this is coming out of a article that's written in Psychology magazine. And I think most of you are aware of this, that there's an in-group biasness, right? So that when I meet others who are of the same group, or either religiously, ethnically, or political affiliation, I automatically see them more in a positive light, even though I may not know nothing about them, except the fact that we share the same religion or ethnicity or political affiliation. I have a far more positive interpretation of who they are and their actions than someone who's outside of my group. If they're outside of my group, I'm already negatively oriented towards them. This is the famous us-them problem. So kinship, altruism, with someone outside of my kinship group, it's competition. So this is what the writers write. Extreme discrimination reveals the worst kind of prejudice, excluding outgroups from full humanity. So they're not fully human. This would be like Nazis with the Jews. Outgroup dehumanization is at least as old as the US Constitution, where blacks were not included. Women were not fully included as well. And as modern as current forms of dehumanization described by outgroup infrahumanization theories, belief that members of outgroups are less human and possess less than human emotional life. Implicit in Alport's work and explicit in the more modern accounts is the idea that severe prejudices reduce the target to less than a human individual, sometimes an animal and sometimes an object. If you remember 2 weeks ago, I talked about Richard Rorty, who argued that everyone believes that some group in the world is fully human and therefore have human rights, but when they come across others outside their group, they dehumanize them, thereby removing some of their human rights. And this is what this article is talking about. Social psychological theory underscores the idea of perceiving some outgroups as less than human. Bartard theorized that groups acting outside societal norms will be excluded from other human groups. Strauss and Schwartz often spoke of moral exclusion, the belief that some social groups operate beyond moral rules and values. Most relevant is the research of Lyons and on outgroup infrahumanization, which demonstrates that dehumanized groups are believed not to experience complex human emotions or to share in-group beliefs. If you remember a while back, I shared how when Africans were brought over in slave ships, and then when their husband and wives were separated and sold, or children removed from parents, the emotions that they exhibited, that many of the white masters and those who are selling the slaves believed that they didn't fully experience the pain of a lost child like a white person did, but instead like animals did when you took away the infant of a gorilla. This is the same type of dynamics where outgroups are dehumanized and the emotional life is no longer seen as being as enriched as fully human individuals. The current results empirically support the idea of dehumanization and are consistent with verbal reports by providing neural evidence to the phenomenon. Right there, the neural evidence. So what they did was they would show pictures of people that are in group and then pictures of people that are out group, and then they did a MRI on their brain. They scanned their brain, and when they saw pictures of people in their in group, the parts of empathy, parts of the brain that exhibited empathy, sympathy, connections, all of that lighted up. But when they showed pictures of people from the out group, it's fear, hostility, those parts of the brain lit up. So look at what they're saying. By providing neural evidence of the phenomena, these data go beyond verbal reports, right? Not merely what they self-report, which may be subject to self-presentational concerns. In other words, they're going to filter what they say in order to look better. Furthermore, if replicated and extended, this kind of evidence could begin to help explain the all-too-human ability to commit atrocities such as hate crimes, prisoner abuse, and genocide against people who are dehumanized. This is a product of evolution, where when you come across those who are like you demonstrate altruism, kinship. But when you come across people who are different from you, then you are evolutionarily conditioned through your neural network to view them as a danger, as something to be oppressed, feared. And that's why when you look at human history, there's so much of that that's built in. So this, I don't know if you watched the movie Interstellar, but there's this one scene where the Matt Damon character, once he's found on that planet, he says, he's in a spaceship and they're traveling, and he says something like, this is the hardest part of humanity, trying to teach one group of people to love another group of people who are different from them. This is the famous us-them problem. I do not believe the theory of evolution can overcome this. And the theory of Dawkins of misfirings do not work, because misfirings are not moral obligations. They're just options of which we choose which ones we ought to follow or should follow. And I believe that it's the Christian religion that provides that principle by which we feel called to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. The last point, and I'm almost done here. The moral truths, sorry about the typo, the moral truths of naturalism can be explained by the Christian faith. My apologies. The moral truths of naturalism can be explained by the Christian faith. So when you have integrity, ethics, respect, and honesty, there are certain moral principles that are foundational. You don't argue to them, you start with them. They're your most basic premises, they're first principles. And they're discovered, not invented. You don't invent them, you don't construct them, you discover them. Now, perhaps the closest analogy may be mathematical truths and the first principles of laws of logic. Moral intuitions, so Robert Arty, so moral intuitions, these are first principles, are not something that you invent. It emerges from within you, and you know it by intuition. So it's non-inferential, in other words, you don't argue for it, or it's directly apprehended. You just immediately see it. It's like when I open my eyes, I see my computer screen, it's immediately apprehended directly. And then these moral intuitions are propositional. In other words, it can be true or false. And then it's comprehensive. You can understand it. And then it's pre-theoretical. In other words, they exist outside of all theory and worldview. And it's the basic way in which you live. And so this is Kai Nielsen. Kai Nielsen is one of the more famous atheists of the second half of the 20th century. And in Kai Nielsen, he says, it is more reasonable to believe such elemental things like wife beating and child abuse to be evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us that we cannot know or reasonably believe any of those things, or reasonably believe any of those things to be evil. These are so basic in principle, so elementary, that we know certain things are evil, even if we believe skeptical things about what is evil or not. At least there are certain truths that you can be rock solid on. I firmly believe that this is bedrock, foundational, and right. And that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his moral beliefs. If you reflect long enough on these moral beliefs, wife beating, child abuse, you can't help but believe that this is that these are wrong. And this is Paul Copeland as a Christian apologist, similar line. Likewise, despite flawed moral judgments, there still are certain moral truths that we cannot not know. You can't help but believe that these moral principles are true unless we suppress our conscience or engage in self-deception. We possess an inbuilt yuck factor, basic moral intuitions about the wrongness of torturing babies for fun or raping, murdering, or abusing children. These are so outside the range of moral possibility, right? That it's okay to rape babies. It's so outside that range that immediately you can't help but say that's morally wrong. I believe that these moral principles from the Christian worldview come from God. So that in Romans chapter 1, right, Paul says that there are things known about God, that he exists and that he is powerful by looking at nature. So when you look out at creation, you see that God exists and that he is powerful because God has shown it to them through nature, through the cosmos. But at the end of Romans chapter 1, Paul also says, though they know God's righteous decrees that those who practice things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. And this is the Gentiles, the pagans. They know God's righteous decree, even though they did not have the laws of God, and that those who practice such things will be held to account. They will be judged. But they have suppressed the truth, right? They gave themselves over. And so in the language of Copeland, they sear their conscience in such a way that they do them, in spite of the fact that they know they will be judged, and they give approval to those who practice them. And then in chapter 2, you have that famous passage, but when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. It's written in their hearts as fundamental, elementary moral principles. By intuition, we can know them, and we know that we will be held in judgment by the way that we live them out. Virtually every movie that I watch that deals with political power, subjugating another power, oppressing another power, I'm not sure I've come across a movie that glorifies the oppressing power. It's always a moral story to fight on behalf of the oppressed individuals, to stand on their side. It's sort of like built into the DNA of our society that we ought to fight for human rights for those who can't. The question is how to explain that. And in my view, in my opinion, the Christian story with its major plot turn events, that's creation in the image of God, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, and the crucifixion of Jesus on the cross to demonstrate God's love for all human beings, those three crucial turning points within the Christian story all affirm that human beings are more valuable than animals, and therefore they have rights that animals do not. I do not believe the theory of evolution comes close to providing. I'm not going to say it's impossible for them, but it does not come close to providing a worldview basis for holding on to the dignity of the human person. That's the final. That's the final part of the human rights. So if I were to just summarize everything, human rights is a part of our language and political theory, economics. It's everywhere. Just open up a newspaper, NPR, radio dialogue. Christianity, to me, best explains why we have human rights. Human rights is part of the kingdom language justification that we talked about last week. And I do not believe the theory of evolution can account for why human beings, by virtue of their dignity, have such rights. And so that's the summary version. But I feel like this whole week all I've been doing is PowerPoint, making PowerPoints. I don't know if you have a question. I see chats in the chat room. I don't know if they're for me or not.
So I have a question.
One more time. Yes. Who is that? Is that Jay?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Hey, Jay. What's up?
Okay. So, in conclusion, are you saying that you believe that human rights is an obligation that us Christians should follow? Like when we see a person that is, in your words, oppressed, that we should help that person?
Yes, I believe that it's a moral obligation to help that person. So two quick statements. One, not all Christians agree what rights are human rights. This is not about the content of what human rights are. It's just the concept of human rights in general. So some Christians may not believe in right to life for infants, but other Christians do. So there's disagreements on what those rights are for human beings. But so there's disagreement there. But in terms of whatever rights you believe human beings do have, as a Christian, that's a moral obligation. Because remember, whatever is a human right, the correlation is a human duty. So if I have a right to life, then you have a duty to not take my life. So you have that correlation. So when you have the 10 Commandments and thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not give false testimony, those are duties that you are obligated to your neighbor or people around you, and the people around you then have the right not to be lied to or not to have their life taken away from you. So in that sense, the answer is yes, Christians have the obligation to protect and satisfy the rights of others. But keep in mind, not everyone agrees what those rights are.
Okay, thank you. And we're on the same page then.
Okay, yes. Are there any other questions? I think we have like 10 minutes, but.
Hi, Pastor. This is Matteo.
Hey, Matteo.
Hi, as usual. I have a couple of questions, but just flagging that, and I can wait to the end.
Oh, yeah. Are there anyone else who has a question or a comment that you have a comment you'd like to make? Otherwise, we have like 7-8 minutes and I can let Matteo have the floor. Or is there a comment or? Okay. Matteo, you have the floor.
Yeah, no, just a brief question. So, first I have short two comments. One, not every Christian believes in human rights, like McIntyre denies that human rights exist. And second, unless we use the continuity property loosely, evolution does not require continuity. It requires that there are small steps when species changes, but it doesn't require that between two steps on the same line, there are always another step. But regardless of that, I wonder, even if one accepts evolution and these small steps, stepwise change, that doesn't mean that we cannot reach a point in which some being acquire some properties that will ground special rights to that being. Like when you start with a grain of sand, you keep adding, at some point you have a heap, and you have the heap as new property acquired by this stepwise change that at the beginning the single grain or couple of grains, 3 grains didn't have. So I'm not saying that I know which property will ground human rights, but I'm saying if one claims that through evolution it's impossible, it seems that one should have approved that every change brought about by evolution cannot create a cannot get to a being that has property that grounds human rights. I'm not sure why that would be the case.
So let me respond to Alistair McIntyre. He does not believe in human rights per se, but he does believe in human duty. So unless he is able to separate the correlation theory between human rights and human duty, I'm not sure how he can say he doesn't believe in human rights. He does not affirm it, but I believe that he has to affirm it, because as long as you have human duty to others, then others have that right to expect that duty to be performed for them. So on one level, I agree with you, but on another level, I think the theory of correlation has to hold for him. So you might want to respond to that. But the second one is, if there is a property that is emergent, so we're talking about emergent property, theory of evolution. One, it would be nice to know what that emergent property would be. Generally, it's intelligence that's proposed as, I mean, that's the most common one that I see. The problem here is that it's a difference of degree between differences in intelligence between higher level conscious species and human beings. It's still an issue of degree, not metaphysical gap. But secondly, if you do have that property and if you name it, you're going to have degrees of differences of that property within human species themselves. So I remember talking a little bit to Charles before, but if it is intelligence and there are members of the human species that do not exhibit that property, such as you know, the Alzheimer's, or those who are in vegetative state, or those who are having neurological difficulties, then their human rights would have to be lessened or sacrificed. And I think that may be an issue with that emergent theory. And then lastly, I'm not arguing it's impossible for a theory of evolution to account for human rights. I'm saying that it's extremely difficult. Because whatever property you choose, I think there's going to be degrees of differences within humanity. I'm sure you have responses, Matteo.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's better maybe if I move to the next question. So to avoid, we spoke about this problem, avoiding belaboring the same point just between us.
Right.
So thanks for the answer. So the second question is, I agree that so if we say that a naturalist
Matteo, you're
has problems to
Matteo, you're breaking up.
Sorry, is it get better? Because I'm in the car.
Okay. Home Depot and then the car.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Are you saying anything now?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're breaking in and out.
So I agree that I'm not sure that can see. I give up. And let me write in the chat.
Okay. We're almost getting to the point where we're out of time as well.
I have a quick question.
Oh, yeah, Antonio.
Yeah, nice job. By the way, very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind for me is for human. I don't think you can get it if you just have natural selection. Then all you really have is a gentleman's agreement, or what should we just say,
right.
civil rights. It's just what people agree upon to make their society work. You can't really have a logical basis for defending the right not to be murdered, and eventually that could come to things like euthanasia and all those things. It can develop to that. Like I was saying, Pete Singer said it's okay to kill a kid with Down syndrome because they're less valuable.
Right.
He's just using reason.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to point out that in the Enlightenment, they did make a distinction between God-given rights. I mean, the right to have your life, the right to have your freedom, the right to have the fruits of your labor,
right.
and civil rights, the rights that come on top of that. Those are government-given rights, and that people agree upon.
I think you hit right on the point that I think Darwin was struggling with, because Darwin had struggles with the British Empire and the slave in their colonies and things. And so part of his hope was to show the brotherhood of men and use kinship and reciprocal altruism in order to get a better world. But as you mentioned, as in the slides as well, when you have a power differential, reciprocal altruism goes out the window. And so the social contract, that's what you're talking about, right? You come and agree on the principles. That's a social contract theory. The problem is that that works best when we're all of about equal power. But when you have one group that's far more powerful than another group, then the question is, why should they follow the social contract obligations in the first place then? What is it? That's the Greeks and I forgot, the Medians. You know, when the Greeks and was it the Sparta had that war, and one of the colonies had stayed neutral.
The Persians.
The war they came. So you have that social contract theory where power differentials create this. There's no longer needed to follow those obligations, and that's why, for me, the right to human life and the obligation to provide that has to come from a power that's greater than the human level in order for that moral authority to flow. It has to be transcendent. I remember, I'll end with this. You remember Chuck Colson?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you're old enough.
Oh, yeah.
Colson, you know, after he became a Christian, you know, he wrote Born Again, and then he wrote all these books on politics and Christianity. And I remember one time he had this one article that he wrote that he was citing a Jewish lawyer who said the article was titled "Who Says?" Who says, right? And so it's like a barroom fight where they're having a conflict, and they say, you know, it should be this way, it should be that way. The question is, well, who says? Who says? Unless you have someone who's of a transcendent authority that is able to speak down to us or to us, if we're on the same horizontal level, who says, right? Your word against what you want versus what I want, it's the same level, unless you get a social contract. But the problem is when you have a power differential, what I say matters more than what you say. And that was an interesting article. It's 12:20, and I think I'm going to bring this to a close. This is
I try to write in the chat, Pastor, if you can give a quick look, but if you cannot, that's fine.
What does it got? Oh, let me read it, and then I don't know if we're. I try to write here. This is Mateo. I try to write here, if we have time. What does a God decree that humans have rights would contribute to grounding these rights? Epistemically, we would need to check whether God is good, and metaphysically, it is irrelevant to allow God to change moral laws. I think we're back to that same discussion that we had. At one point, you're going to have a brute start with intuition as the initiating warrant for that particular brute start. So Mateo and I have had email discussions, and I think you used the word intuition, right, Mateo?
Right. Coming from Robert Howdy, by the way.
Right, okay.
I was thinking about Robert Howdy, which was my professor.
Okay, and I'm working off of all and planning that they're properly basic beliefs, these ethical principles, and the verification of the goodness of these principles. You can't have an endless chain, right? So you have to have some starting point, and I choose God as that starting point. You're going to have a starting point at some point, or a naturalist will have to have some kind of starting point. And when you have that starting point, you can't argue for that starting point. It has to be an intuitively recognized that it's just right, you know, as raping babies for fun kind of a thing. Yeah, I'm not sure you can ground, well, it's intuitively grounded, not propositionally warranted. But I guess we can talk more through email. I'll send word out about Sunday school, but for now, let's bring this to a close, and we'll figure out what we'll do. Boy, let me close this. So we're done with the apologetic section, and I'm grateful for all of you who have attended through the weeks, and for people who dialogue, and Mateo for asking questions and showing the other side as well. I'm grateful for that. Let me just pray, and then we'll close this Sunday school course. Father, thank you for this time that we had together. Lord, it feels like we started months ago, and we went through a lot of different topics, and some more difficult than others. And it's just my prayer, Lord, that we would continue to learn more about you and your word, but the things that we learn would not remain simply as knowledge within our head, but it would translate to actions, things that we do and say in our world in order to defend the rights of those around us. And so we thank you for this time. Pray that everyone have a great day today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, everyone, thank you for coming, and have a great day. Good lunch. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Mateo.
Bye-bye.